Bill Weikel, or Montana Bill, who was born in Missoula and has lived here for over 77 years. Graduated from Missoula County High School in 1965 and from Montana State University with a BS in Civil Engineering in 1970. He has had a connection with the surveying and engineering professions for 60 years. He's had an interest in history all his life. His career and interest in history met in the 90s when he began intensively studying the measuring and mapping methods of Lewis and Clark, John Mullen, David Thompson, the history of surveying, and now Missoula area history from the mind of a surveyor. I'll let him tell you the rest.
Your native thing? Okay. Well, thank you for coming out tonight. Hopefully I can make it worthwhile for you to take your time. As she says, in the surveying history world, national surveying history world, I'm Montana Bill, because I am one of the few people in the western United States that actively is involved in surveying history. We've got a few people out in Washington and a few down in California, but most of ours are east of the Mississippi. I build this presentation as pre-1860 through 1891, and at a meeting the other day, Kim Brigham asked me why 1891, thinking it has some significance. Reality was, I says, that's all the slides I can fit in that period of time. Well, I went back and started going through it, and I had to chip it back to 1888 because there's a lot of surveying work that takes place between 1888 and 1891, which would have added another 20 slides. So I got started on this about 2-3 years ago when I started going to a group, meeting with a group in Bonner once a week, and we'd talk about history, various aspects of history. And one thing I recognized that most of us, including myself, did not really have a good sense for how Missoula became Missoula. You know, there was a lot of conception, et cetera, but not really a lot of to me, as an engineer, linear fact. And so I went down a rabbit hole, and I'm still going down that rabbit hole. One thing I discovered is that just in the last week or so, all of a sudden it hit me that in 5 years, I will have lived in Missoula for half of its history. You know, now I know that I'm a youngster compared to some, so I was going to ask how many have lived here in the Missoula area for 60 years, at least 60.
While you're doing that, we're just going to move this down a little bit. There we go.
Okay, 70? 80? I don't think I've got a 90, do I? Haven't you been here that long, Anna? How long have you been here, 80? You've been here 80, haven't you? Not 90, but you've been here all your life, haven't you?
No.
Oh.
Thanks for the compliment.
So anyhow, when I got started down this rabbit hole, I started diving into all kinds of records from state, territorial, federal, railroad, and a lot of them were stuff that I had utilized at one time or another during my 55 years of involvement in, or 50 years plus of involvement in surveying, researching records, etc. And some of them I was revisiting, but at the same time, when I was doing some of these 50 years ago to do stuff like the Commissioner's Journal, I had to go to the courthouse and I had to leaf through these massive books to try to identify what was in the Commissioner's Journals. Well, now I can go online, thanks to Gary Little, who brought me onto this one, I can go online and work my way through this stuff. For my research, I do not use a lot. I use newspapers, magazines, history talks, and written histories to get ideas of what I want to look for in a record. As with today, Most often what you read in a lot of stuff is not based on really a detailed research of it. Oftentimes it's based on what the writer or the speaker knows of at that time, and so I really took a deep dive. One thing that I did use a lot to get my start was this Missoula the Way It Was, which was by Lenora Cobell. Anybody into my Cobell right term? My bride gave me this back in 1972 when it first came out, and I read it cover to cover, and that's where I got my start of really diving into Missoula history. Okay, I'm going to start with a little bit of, I got to figure this system out. Okay, here we go. I'm going to start a little bit with the history before Missoula came about. Okay, we started out in 1805. There were only indigenous peoples in the Missoula and Bitterroot valleys. 1805 and 1806, Lewis and Clark spent 2 nights each year at Travelers Rest. In 1812, David Thompson with the Northwest Company, an explorer and trapper, came into the valley and observed. He came specifically out of the north to observe where Lewis and Clark had been. So he came to a hill northeast of the airport, got up there and identified some of what he thought it was and described it and took some measurements that are difficult, to say the least. From 1812 to 1860, there's record of a lot of travelers, trappers, etc. in the Missoula Valley, Missoula and Bitterroot Valley, excuse me. I read one where there's 135 men came through in one trapping expedition in 1825. We have a lot of people that are associated with the mission down at St. Mary's and Fort Owen. During that time period, they're using that as a source for getting supplies. There are some people that are in the Missoula Valley or out drawing water off of Grant Creek and Butler Creek in order to have habitation here. In 1841, the Jesuits established the St. Mary's Mission down the Bitterroot. I'm going to back up 1 second for my old roads friends over here, is that I do welcome a few questions as I go along. If you really can't wait to get an answer, then raise your hand and I might call on you. And part of that rejuvenates me to get me cranked up if I'm not enough already. So, okay. In 1846, the Oregon country was split up between the United States and England. It was originally the 42nd parallel to the 5440 parallel west of the Rocky Mountains. It was divided and 42nd to 49th came under the jurisdiction of the United States. In 1848, the United States, Oregon country became Oregon Territory. In 1850, the Oregon Territory passed an act that anybody that had been in the Oregon Territory, and at this time that was all the way over in Missoula Valley, Missoula Bitterroot Valley existed too at that time, but anybody that had been there before 1850 could claim 320 acres for himself and 320 acres for his spouse. And so John Owen, I don't know all the details of how this transpired, but John Owen bought the St. Mary's Mission improvements from the Jesuits, and 2 months later, that Oregon Land Donation Act went into effect, and John Owen purchased or filed his 2 claims for himself and his wife, who was a Native American. In 1853-54, the Pacific Railroad surveyors came through the valleys looking for possible routes for a railroad through the northern tier of territories. In 1853 to 1860, Washington Territory was created, with Missoula being part of part of Clark County, Skamania County, Walla Walla County, and then Spokane County. Now the importance of this as I talk along is that they didn't really have good access to government. Anybody that was in the Missoula Valley did not have good access to any kind of government. The territorial government of Washington was in Olympia, and then these other, the closest that it ever got to Missoula was the Spokane County, where the county seat was in Spokane. So it took a little time to get anything done by your government. 1855, they had the treaty talks between Isaac Stephen and the native tribes out here at Council Grove. In 1860, the Mullen Military Wagon Road was created through the Missoula Valley. That was, if you don't know a lot of that, that was from Fort Walla Walla in Washington Territory to Fort Benton in, at that point, Dakota Territory. 1860, Warden and Higgins established their trading post out west of town in what became known as Hellgate. It wasn't originally named Hellgate. I think it was in what was termed at that time Hellgate Round. I'm not sure I pronounced that right, but Hellgate Round, which was, it means in French means round. So it was the greater Missoula Valley was called the Hellgate Round, but the community that they started became known as Hellgate. In 1860, Missoula County of Washington created, so now they've got a government here, and the county seat was at Hellgate. 1862, Idaho Territory was created. With the territorial capital in, I can't remember, Boise? I can't remember for sure. Okay, 1863 was when the Missoula County of Idaho Territory was created. 1864, Montana Territory was created. 1864, Higgins, Warden, Patty began construction of the mills that started as a community that became known as Missoula Mills. And again, it wasn't named Missoula Mills. It was in what was that at that point Missoula County, but I think people started calling it Missoula Mills. I'm going to backtrack just a hair what I was going to tell you in the beginning of when I create this, as I think my way through it and as I research, I create slides. And I add things to slides, I put things on there that might be pertinent, I eliminate slides, and so this ends up being what I think of as show and tell, okay? I've got slides for you and I'm gonna talk about it and they're gonna spur me to what I say. Okay, the people that came in here and had some sort of influence on the early property development in Missoula. Frank Warden first came into the valley in 1856 with a group of traders that were going to trade with the Indians. I think he came out of Salt Lake area. He was the co-founder of Hellgate and Missoula Mills. Christopher Higgins came along with Warden. He had been in here since in the 1850s with that Pacific Railroad survey. He had been a wagon driver with that, so he was familiar with the valley. And again, he was a partner with Frank Warden in Walla Walla in the late 1850s. There we go again. It's hard to practice on this at home. I've got my own screen, but I still don't, I stand different here, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, Alfred Erlin, he arrived in the Missoula 1870. He became a clerk for Warden and Company. By this time, Higgins had got into other stuff like banking and the like, and Warden was really the true trader, so he was still operating stores not only in Missoula but in other places. But Erlin came to work for him, and then he acquired land north of the Orange Street underpass. Cyrus McClurk, he had connections to Warden and Higgins in Walla Walla. Warden bought his original store in Walla Walla from either Cyrus McCormick or his brother William. I'm not sure. Different histories tell me different things, so I can't stand on any of it. He acquired title to a piece at the mouth of Rattlesnake. He sold it to his brother William. William sold it to the town company that was Higgins, Warden, and W.J. McCormick. William Edwards, I couldn't find much about him. I really tried to find, but he acquired title to a strip of land that is at the canyon of Hellgate, from about Van Buren east, and includes a lot of the Clark Fork River. I'll talk later about the significance of the land that these guys got. Hugh O'Neill had connections to the Missoula Valley early on. There's record of him working on people's houses here in the 1850s. He has some notoriety is that in the 1860s in Virginia City, they had, I think it was something like an 85-round boxing match. Bare knuckle. Kim, do you remember that one? Was it 85 rounds or something like that? Do you remember? Okay. Anyhow, that was Con Oram and Hugh O'Neill. So the interesting thing with Hugh O'Neill is that he was not a settler, and I'll talk to you about why he acquired the land that he did. William Stevens constructed the first bridge across the Clark Fork in this area. Did that in 1869, near today's Poverello Center. He acquired a homestead that was from roughly the Poverello Center on the north side of the river west to Mountain Supply. A.B. Hammond showed up later. I didn't look a lot for stuff on him. There's a lot of stuff about A.B. Hammond, but I didn't spend a lot of time looking at all of his stuff. But he ended up being vice president of the Missoula Real Estate Association, which owns some land that's involved in this early development of Missoula. So when all these people start showing up in Missoula, okay, the Pacific Railroads from surveys from 1853 to 55 had created this map, or it's a very large map. This is a portion of it, but in that map, they note that there's a option of coming down the Blackfoot. There's an option of coming down the Clark Fork. There's an option of going up the Jocko, and there's an option of going down the Clark Fork, okay? Those are the possible places that they could put a railroad, ideally, okay? Right here, no matter which way they go, they're going through there, okay? And that's Hellgate Canyon, right in there. No matter what you do, you're going through Hellgate Canyon. And Higgins and Warden had both been here ahead of that. They knew that that was going to happen. When they first came to Missoula, they knew that that was going to happen. Problem they face is when they come to Missoula, land ownership to gain title to the land is relatively non-existent in the Missoula Valley. After that, that Land Donation Act only lasted for 3 years. And then after that, in 51, the beginning of the GLO. Everybody know what GLO is? Anybody doesn't? Okay. Somebody doesn't, but no guts. But anyhow, it started over here in the Willamette Valley, and it was going to be a long time before it would get out to Missoula. Where'd my mouse go? There it is. There he's back. And so even though at that time you could buy 320 acres, you had to have the GLO system to do it. So you couldn't just go out in the Missoula area and say, I want 320 acres right here. You had to have GLO there ahead of time in order for you to do that. So again, once there was relatively no way for somebody to acquire title to land in the Missoula Valley. So they come into a scene that looks something like this, okay? We've got 3 water sources in the general area. We've got Grant Creek out here to the west. We've got the Rattlesnake, which is obviously is a major stream, and we've got this little Paddy Creek that comes down here, and to the best I can tell, did not even reach the river. It just kind of flooded out down where Sentinel, down in that area. We've got are there any geology people in here? I'll have to have you talk to me about what I portrayed on here, because I'm sure where I'm showing these benches and the river flow, that all of this was initially created when the lake flooded out. There's some very definite reasons I can see that, but you'll have to show me that. But anyhow, so when Higgins and Warden come here to set up their trading post, I think at that point they know that this is going to be down in here, is going to be the place that they want to have established a city in the long run. But right now they can't own the land. They know the railroad's going to come through. Okay, so they go out here to where they can get water out of Grant Creek, because no matter where you're at, you've always got to have water. So they go out there where they can do that, and then they are right adjacent to the Mullen Road, which has just been created through the valley. Backing up a little bit, when they were out in Walla Walla, John Mullen was out there at the time. They were very aware that Mullen was going to build this road. They were waiting for him to get the road constructed before they headed out here. In the record, it says that they came out here with 75 pack animals bringing goods out to start their trading post. And so they had to have some sort of a reasonable trail road ahead of them. So they waited till word had got back to them in 1860 that Mullen had reached the Missoula Valley. So they went back there or they got started and brought those trade goods out, and they established that trading post down here. They initially started out with it in a tent, basic canvas tent. Then David Patty, who was basically role as a builder, he built a lot of things in the Missoula Valley, but he built a log cabin. Okay, interesting. I mean, I think that was Woody in a later date standing in the doorway, and you can see, unless he's huge, whoops, excuse me, unless he's huge, that's about a 7-foot tall, 6 to 7 foot tall on the inside of that building. But that's all they needed at the time. A community grew up around it. This is somebody's concept of it. But a bunch of places, they had a blacksmith shop, they had a bar, a couple other things there. Warden and Higgins had a license from the Washington Territory to establish a trading post. But all the other structures around them, I'd have to think that they're considered squatters, because even Higgins and Warden don't own that land. So none of those own it either. So they're all just living there. Any question? Give me one good question. God, I've scared everybody off. Yes?
Where did Woody and Warden and Higgins, where did they come from?
Before they went to Missoula, Walla Walla.
They're originally from Walla Walla?
Well, no, they're originally from somewhere else, but they all ended up in Walla Walla, and Woody was the bookkeeper for Warden and Higgins in Walla Walla, Hellgate, and Missoula. Okay, so no sooner do they get here and start that trading post, then things start to boom. Okay, the Idaho Gold Rush started in 1860, quickly spread throughout this central northern Idaho area. The Montana Gold Rush, there was first some stuff at Gold Creek, but it primarily started booming in 1862 at Bannock. So all of a sudden this whole area is booming. Okay, Warden starts a store at Gold Creek, starts another store at Deer Lodge, and starts another store at Virginia City. So like I said earlier, is that he's the trader. Higgins is not really as much interested in trading. I think he's a wheeler dealer in the long run. But Warden is the trader. In 1861, the Civil War started. Interesting thing that happened in the Civil War is that prior to the Civil War, Congress, the House had been trying to pass homestead acts to where people could come west and acquire land and be farmers. And so the northern states controlled the House, and so they would vote positively, but the Senate was split, and so every time they did it, I think 4 or 5 times in the 1850s, and every time it got shot down by the Senate. And so they couldn't get that Homestead Act passed. And so when the southern states seceded, unintended consequences, now they no longer had a vote. So in 1862, the Senate passed the first Pacific Railroad Act, providing incentives for construction of railroads connecting the Mississippi and the West Coast. They passed the Federal Homestead Act, providing incentives for people to settle in the West. They also passed the School Act that provided sections 16 and 36 as a very township to go for the schools to support agricultural education. That was the focus of the North, as they were trying to get farmers, people to come out that were immigrants and people living in Boston, New York, to be able to go west and become farmers. The South wanted to acquire all the land so that they could expand the safes, expand the plantations. It's an interesting thing. I'd never even thought about that till I ran into this. So the Homestead Act provided that you could get 160 acres with a minor fee, required to live on it for 5 years, build a 14 by 12 foot house. You know, I think the 14 by 12 is interesting because my office is 14 by 20. And I can't imagine living in that with a spouse and a couple of kids. And then, but it again implied that the GLO surveys had been performed, which hadn't happened yet. Okay, 63, again, the Idaho Territory was created. Missoula County of Idaho Territory is outlined here. What it's doing at that time, it's taken in Deer Lodge and Missoula, or Hellgate, and up here just land. All that is just, there's nothing much going on up there.
You said it was owned by the tribes, right?
Pardon?
There were people there, the natives.
Yes, there were natives there. Yeah, yeah. But they weren't following, well, they're a different kind of government. Yes. Yep. That's your one question. Everybody gets one. You wasted your chance. In 1864, the Pacific Railway was started, or the Northern Pacific Railway was chartered. That signals to Higgins and Warden that they're coming, that they're probably coming. It might be a while, but they're coming. And so, and then in 1864, Montana Territory is created. And in January 65, Missoula County of Montana Territory created. Well, what's happened is all of it's coming together to signify to Higgins and Warden that now is the time to make their move and move in and create a mill, because they've got the demand for wood, they've got the demand for grain, they've got the probability that they're going to find a way to acquire ownership of the land, and so they move in to start the mill. From a geological standpoint, or actually a siting standpoint, I guess I'd say, is that they are on the inside of a bend of the river, so their erosion's going to be lower. There's actually, at that time, there's a couple of channels. This channel here is later termed as a slough, so it's a real slow water thing, but it gives them the ability to bring logs down and pull them into this area and then take them up on the shore to use for the sawmill. They put a ditch in, can put a ditch in from the Rattlesnake Creek, bring it down to run the flour mill. So that's why I believe that they picked this site right here. Looking at another view, this is something I created just a few days ago. As you can see, this is an aerial view on Google Earth of this, and you can see the river goes to the right and then goes to the left, and the Missoula Mills is on the inside of that curve. One thing I didn't recognize until I looked at this was that Jacobs Island is a man-made island because they cut a trench down the backside of it in order to steer the water into the ditch that goes out to all the south side of Missoula. Okay, so in the fall of 1864, they start their mills. They ultimately build this sawmill here, grist mill over here. You can see the paddle wheel in here. This is a later picture of the grist mill. One thing that's I find interesting on this is that they built that bottom floor of the grist mill out of rock, and they put cribbing on the sawmill, and this was because they were right next to the river, and it gave allowance for if high water came up, they weren't going to have those, they weren't going to lose those that easy. Because the logic is they are right down at river level. So that was started by Warden, Higgins, and Patty. Patty stays there. Sir?
Did they have their own lumber company to get the wood to run their mill?
That was pirating. There was no Timber Act yet. I can't remember when the Timber Act was passed, but there was no Timber Act yet. And so they would, when cabins, anything at the mining camps, when mining camps, they didn't own any of the land at mining camps. And they went out and they took logs and built stuff. They weren't doing it in enough volume to where it really created a problem. It didn't, as Bill Taylor would tell you, it didn't create a problem until they started building the railroad and they needed all those ties, and they started doing the underground mining to where you needed to have all that shoring. But anyhow, David Patty, being the builder, he stays there to build, and Higgins and Warden head off to the legislature to influence the bills. Frank Warden ended up representing Missoula, Deer Lodge, and Choteau. While they're there, they connect with W.J. McCormick, who was in Virginia City as an attorney at the time, and he represented Madison County. I think based on what I've seen, it may have, typical in those days is you might take your family with you to the legislature. You're going to be gone for 3 months, so you take the family. And I suspect that Higgins took his sister with him, and McCormick became enamored because a few years later, he's back in Missoula, and he ends up marrying Higgins' sister. So we start the Missoula Mills. Okay, and it begins down here. We got the 2 mills, and then they start building houses and other businesses along what eventually became Front Street. Okay, they passed an act at that first Territorial legislature, which I'm sure was pushed by Higgins and Warden and ultimately McCormick, but they passed an act that was called the Declaration of Occupancy, and it allowed you to file a 160-acre homestead on an irregular shaped parcel in the absence of the GLO surveys, because the GLO surveys hadn't gotten to Missoula Valley. There was nothing there yet. So they passed that, and so this is my conjecture of where they might been. Okay, and I've seen some descriptions of the dimensions, but there's nothing that they're really tied to. But based on later stuff, it's kind of like this, and all they're doing is they're just picking an area, and what they're doing, them and Cyrus McQuirk, who's connected to Warden, okay? Cyrus McQuirk, they all pick these sites that are in the path of where the railroad's going to go, because they see the opportunity that's what they want to be able to tap into. Other than Cyrus McQuirk, them, the Higgins and McCormick and some others that I talk about had no aspirations of being farmers. They were trying to get the land so that they could have to be able to develop it when the time came. In that time period also, when that declaration of occupancy out in this area out here, west of Reserve, there was a whole bunch of declarations of occupancy went in order to basically for people that did want to be farmers, to grow wheat, to be milled, and to grow vegetables and the like that could be sent to the mining camps. Warden had it somewhere out here. He had a claim, which I think he filed a claim. The best I could tell, his claim might have included the original Hellgate trading post site and any other buildings that were there. And I think he was trying to protect that for at least long enough to be able to haul the logs somewhere else and be able to use them. I don't know for sure. One unintended consequence of that 1862 Homestead Act was that there was no allowance for people to start a town. You had to have file a homestead. A person could file a homestead. They could prove up on it over 5 years, and at the end of that 5 years, they owned the homestead, and they could create a subdivision there and start a town. But that gave them an advantage, because people that were trying to start a town didn't have a way to do that. They couldn't just come out and start a town. So in 1867, the federal government and then Montana Territory also passed acts that allowed people as a group to form a corporation and declare a certain piece of property that they wanted to acquire to create a town. Because you had all these people that all they wanted to have was a blacksmith shop, a bar, a barber shop, anything, but they needed to have a place to do that. And so somewhere down in here along the riverfront, they filed on the town site, filed for a town site. And at that time also, it didn't have to be a GLO, or it could be done without a GLO in place. How do people teach where they got to talk for a whole day? Okay, in 1867, the GLO was started in Montana. They started at a point down southwest of Three Forks, up on Willow Creek, Little Ridge. This is myself and Ron Milam. We went down there in 2012 to create an article commemorating the Surveyor's Week of the year. And Kim Brigham went with us, and Tom Bauer. How did I do, Kim? I got Tom. I had to look him up, but I thought that was his name. But we went down there and we took a picture of me set up over top of this initial point down there, and Ron out there, and we're holding a chain to measure a distance. That at that time, that's 135 miles away from Missoula, and this starts in '67. So Higgins and Warden and Missoula, they still don't know when when that GLO is going to reach Missoula. So they're in the process of proving up on their on their irregular shaped parcel. 1869, Northern Pacific Railroad Reconnaissance Survey comes through the Missoula Valley. They're basically way out ahead of the construction of the railroad, reaffirming what, to a certain extent, of what the Pacific Railroad surveys had done 53 to 55. They come into the Missoula Valley and they write this, and there's this report, which is an extensive report done by a civil engineer with the railroad company. And they say that there's 25 to 30 dwellings in Missoula. Okay, number of them well built. The grist mill and a sawmill, McCork's garden. So this is your 160 acres, has 5 acres in vegetables. And then McCormick, Warden, and Higgins and other gentlemen assist them in making this, or understanding what's going on in the country and where they might want to go. In 1870, the Pacific Railroad starts construction from both ends at Carlton and, where was it, right by Portland, Bill? General area. Okay, and they start from both ends, but by 1873, there's a financial panic and everything stops for the next 7 years. And so that's as far as it gets. And so Higgins and Warden are expecting to get there. It's already got started. They're expecting it in the mid-1870s, but it gets delayed for 7 years. Okay, so before they have their 5 years of occupation on that irregular shaped parcel, the GLO gets to Missoula. So now all of a sudden we've got a survey in Missoula that has sections, has adequate parts of sections. So somewhere they made choices of who would take which parcels, and that were near where they had their declaration of occupancy. They sorted that out, and so initially Cyrus McCourt gets this 160 acres down here, kind of at the mouth of the Rattlesnake. The town site gets 40 acres. C.P. Higgins gets 160 acres. McCormick gets 160 acres. It also, the lot 6 or section 16 up here is a territorial section, so they get that. But I think that I suspect that Higgins and Warden and McCormick encouraged these other people to file on these other parcels so that eventually they could control that too. As I said earlier, Erlin was Warden's clerk, so he files on this area north of the Orange Street underpass. Hugh O'Neill files on a thing over here that's a third of it's on the hillside. William Edwards files one down here where it's portions across the river, over half of it's on the hillside, a lot of it's the river. He has no intention really at that point of being a homesteader, but he's again trying to corner that property that will later help Higgins and McCormick. Same thing with William Stevens down here. Out west of Reserve, the same thing happens. Actually, west of Russell, same thing happens, is that these people who have filed declarations of occupancy have to switch around, and they all end up getting parcels that are identified here on the year that they were patented. So you can see that if they're 5 years, if they started their patent in 1866 or 67, they finally prove up on it after 5 years, and so they get their patent in 72. Oh, I jumped back just a hair here. One thing that happened I didn't mention is that, let me drop back just a couple here. Let's see. Right here, the best I can tell, they established a burial ground out here in the area that's now known as the Cherry Street Cemetery. If you've heard recently in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of controversy around that area. But they established a thing here outside of McQuirk's property. So that was on federal land. And they were good with that. That wasn't a problem because McQuirk was going to prove up on this. Nobody wanted to claim this at the time, so it's no problem, okay? The problem arises when they end up having to take the sections. Now all of a sudden part of that's on McQuirk's patent, so he actually owns part of that cemetery, and O'Neill owns the other part of that cemetery. And this leads to a long, convoluted history of that cemetery, which I just told Paula here earlier that her and I are going to work on that for this time next year. There's a lot of research to understand what's really going on. Okay. The one thing that happened on that cemetery is that they recognized the problem, and so they start trying to divert from there. And so in '73, the Sisters of Charity established a cemetery, which is now the St. Mary's Cemetery. And it's located on land that I believe is likely leased for Montana Territory. It's on that section 16. Higgins bought what David Patty had patented at the mouth of Patty Creek. Him and Warden bought that, and they established what was called the Higgins Cemetery down there. And so I think that might have been an alternative since the Rattlesnake one was phasing out. They needed a place to bury, and so Higgins was providing that so that people didn't have to be buried in the Catholic cemetery.
Higgins Street or Higgins Cemetery, is that the one on the corner going up to Patty Canyon?
Yes. Yes, this is right at the end of, it's actually, I picked this up of what's shown on a map at one point, and it's probably, if you look at that when you go down there next time, you'll see that there's kind of a bench where these condos are, right there at the end of the street that's up 8-10 feet above the rest of the area. And so it wasn't easily usable for farming, and so I think that's why they picked that spot.
And that cemetery is now a city cemetery.
Pardon?
The burial for that cemetery is now a city cemetery.
Yes, and that's what you're going to help me on, because I know all the Higgins were reinterred there at the city cemetery.
Also
McCormick's too? Okay, good, good. Okay, they needed infrastructure in the, sir, yes, sir.
The Higgins Cemetery, that became the city cemetery, or
The what?
the Higgins Cemetery is what was the Cherry Street Cemetery?
No, the Higgins Cemetery is at the south end of Higgins Avenue, right where it turns into Southwest Higgins.
Where it turns into what?
Southwest Higgins, going to 39th. There.
Are there still graves there?
Oh, God, no. No, that's what Paulette was just saying down here, is that they, I can't remember the year, I think when, was it?
It was like 1902, they moved all the burials from Higgins to the city cemetery
Oh.
because the hill was starting to crumble down.
Well, also, I don't think they wanted it there, and also, I think that's when Higgins' wife passed away. And so that triggered moving them all to the new cemetery. Sir?
It's actually considered a private cemetery because the founding fathers' families, early on, when the scarlet fever and all of that went through Missoula, that's where they buried their children.
So my understanding is the Cherry Street Cemetery that became absorbed in two different parcels. Pretty much by default, only Chinese were buried there in unmarked graves.
I'm going to cut that one short right now because that's next year's presentation. I'll show you a couple things as I go along here if I don't get too sidetracked. But I'm working on trying to understand all of that. So anyhow, you needed infrastructure. So they had early water systems. Everybody needed to have water. So they had what everybody calls one-eyed Riley ran a water system. Well, I don't think one-eyed Riley ran the water system. I would say that Higgins or Warden or somebody else ran the water system, and one-eyed Riley and this other Indian boy got water out of the Rattlesnake Creek and delivered it. Okay, but that was in 1866. In 1866, they put this mill ditch out of the Rattlesnake to come down here to the grist mill. In 1868, Higgins put a ditch out of about the same area and ran it along what's now Spruce. And that was within the property that he owned back in that patent. That's within that same property that he owned. And he's trying to distribute water down this area. Okay, Fred Line, what was known as the Fred Line Ditch in 1871, they brought water from, God, it's all the way up somewhere north of the Rattlesnake School. They brought that ditch all the way down. It was known in my youth, it was known as the Hughes Ditch, which went to the Hughes Gardens on East Broadway, but originally it was the Fred Line Ditch. In 1871, they brought water out of the Rattlesnake somewhere up to the northeast of town in a flume. They brought it down to a tank, wooden tank here on the ridge below what we know of as the Waterworks tank up here. Okay, they brought it down there and they distribute it in pipes, wooden pipes, down into these areas. Okay, they needed wood. They needed fuel for heat and for cooking, and so early on, they're using all wood. And in the commissioner's journals, you'll see they're constantly approving payment for so many cords of wood for heating the courthouse and the jail and the like, you know. And so that was what they had. In 1870s, somewhere in there, they discovered coal up north of town on what's Coal Mine Road now, northeast of the dump. I just found out about this a couple weeks ago, and this is, when I'm doing this is where I say I keep upgrading stuff, I keep adding stuff. Well, I didn't even think about this until a couple weeks ago, and I saw there was an article in the Missoulian that was about this lady that was trying to get to that coal and see if there was any dinosaur remnants in it. But in the midst of that article, they talked about it being used for heat in Missoula. So I brought it up to Mr. Dennis Sane over here. Can you hear me? Yeah. I complimented you. Okay. And the day that I told him about it, he says, well, you want to go see it? And so him and I hit it across, and we drove up there, and he was very familiar with this. His son had worked up here at one time. And so we went up and we walked around. All of these have caved in, but there was an adit here. There was an adit about here where this house is, and there was another one back here. And I think out here there was a loading dock. So it was very prominent until when? The 40s, Dennis? Wasn't it until the 1940s it was?
Something Archie told us.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
getting history from Archie Carlson.
Yeah, who does?
Which I find is not always correct.
There you go. But then once the railroad came, then they would have had they would have had coal from different places. Good quality coal. This was not good quality coal. It was very smoky, they say. Okay, you have sewage and garbage disposal. We often don't think about it, but you can see it in some of this old stuff, all of the outhouses, because every structure needs an outhouse or needs to share an outhouse with somebody else. So they had outhouses. The dumps areas were down in here, primarily. Basically, when these houses were first, these various businesses and stuff were first created along Front Street, what would you do? You're going to throw it out the back door, and hopefully next spring the river's going to take it away. As the town starts to grow, they start carrying it down there in a wagon and dumping it there, hoping the same thing. The river's going to take it away. And historically, I've been involved with construction projects along here, and every one of them, you'll find buried garbage. Okay, in 1872, the first subdivisions are created. Okay, And I think the layout for these, they had started at some time beforehand. They just hadn't created the subdivisions. But as houses and businesses are being created, they want to line them up. They don't want everybody just going here, going there, going everywhere. So they start doing that. So what they did is they came down here. The Mullen Road came kind of through where this brown line is. Okay? But they took it down here where Front Street broke off, and they put a straight line to somewhere down here, and then they found a point here where a 90-degree angle put them right between the two mills, and that became the basis for the initial layout of downtown Missoula. The town site and the Higgins and McCormick addition, that was in a subdivision that was created on land owned by both McCormick and Higgins. The town site divided into lots and blocks. One thing you can see on here is all the names of the early pioneers: Warden, Patty, Woody, Bonner, Erlin, McQuirk, Edwards, O'Neill, Warden. So they all had parcels down there. And this was laid out north to the south of here, the east-west streets, Kiwanis and First, and a second down, Second and First. They're laid out parallel to Front Street. To the north, they're laid out to that system that they were using for the whole town. The Higgins and Higgins and McCormick subdivision. That's west of Higgins, south of, I think that road's gone now, but it's kind of railroad, semi-railroad. You can see the original names here: McCormick, John Owen from down the Bitterroot, Thomas Harris, who was part of Fort Owen, Woody, Stevens, who was the one who built that first bridge, and Higgins. And one thing that you have to recognize on subdivisions at that time, and this is a thing that I've looked at when he talks about Cherry Street Cemetery, is that a modern subdivision, surveyor goes in here, they take a parcel of land, they create streets, they create lots, they put a pin at every point that the survey lines change directions. They put in infrastructure. They have to have paved roads, they have to have water, they have to have sewer, they have to have sidewalks. Each lot is designed for one structure. Okay, but in 1872, what they're doing is they're making 30-foot by 130-foot lots to where you can buy one, two, you can buy a whole block if you want to be a farmer. You know, if you want to have a garden here in town, you can buy a whole block. And then, especially like in this 1872, there was no state law that required any monuments be set. And so I don't know how they figured out where they were, whether they put some controls in so that they could go back and lay out the lots, but there was no law of where you of putting monuments in. I need a quick breather. Anybody got a good question?
What do you mean by putting in monuments?
A pin, an iron pin, is what we do in today's world. They at that time would put in wooden stakes. You're late. You don't get to ask questions. What? Yeah.
Bill, on those 1872 lots, it looked like there was an alley platted.
Yes.
Why did they do that there?
So that you could get to your outhouse and your stable, your whatever from the backside. I mean, alleys were prevalent all the way through to Southwest Higgins in Missoula.
Alleys were a thing.
They were a thing, yes. Alleys were a thing, yes. Okay, south of the river, during those 70s, there's stuff going on. Okay, 1872, this earlier bridge had washed out over here by Poverello. That had washed out, so in 1872, under contract with the county, a bridge was constructed that lined up with the direction of travel down the Bitterroot. Okay, part of it was it was dedicated as a public road from the end of this bridge down to what was then known as, they had an event called the 1875 Western Montana Agricultural, Mechanical, and Mineral Association, which is kind of the predecessor of the fair in today's fair, but it's down in that same area, but they don't have any title to any land. Okay, God, I must be getting tired. One thing that this, you know, when I talked about this bridge, okay, this bridge lines up with Stevens Avenue. Okay, and that's part of why Stevens Avenue ended up being there, because it was already public dedicated road. And so when they subdivided that area, they included it. When I was meeting with my associates last Friday, they were talking about what they didn't recognize what this bridge was. Well, here we have the old bridge, which is that blue bridge, and then the new bridge in the right of way for the new bridge right here, which is where the Bear Tracks Bridge is. Okay, how'd I do, Kim? I'm old Missoula. I've been here for 77 years. It was been Higgins Bridge all my life, and so I'm just trying to make that transition. But anyhow, it was definitely a bridge going across this way, and then was later, somewhere in this time period, I think, was when, you know, when I think this bridge, the blue one, may have washed out, and they put in the new one across to connect with Higgins Avenue. Okay, when the railroad came, the realty men arrived in 1882. Okay, they're determining, or they're acquiring right-of-way through property that's already been claimed. They have the right of eminent domain to get a 400-foot right-of-way through that property. So they start negotiating with property owners, okay, and you know, they're going through no matter what. It just might have to be in courts for years in order to pay for it, but they're going to go through. So they start doing eminent domain, okay. So they have, with McCormick and Higgins and Warden and Erlin controlling all that land, they, I think McCormick went to Helena to meet with the railroad people. He went over there, and he comes back with an agreement that they will trade 500 lots in these different additions, all through here. They will trade 500 lots for the railroad to establish a freight and passenger depot and other shops and railroad buildings in the Missoula area. Right after that, Missoula City is chartered, and it includes all this lands of these people that I'm talking about, all this stuff that has the potential to be developed. A lot of it isn't yet, but it has the potential. Before the railroad gets here, Higgins creates a plat that covers essentially all of his land. This is kind of from Orange Street going east to almost to Madison, and from down here, not exactly sure where I'd be, down at Maine up to the interstate. Okay, Higgins creates a plat for that, and he has all these lots that ultimately end up being being taken by the railroad, and I don't know whether that was included in that 500 lots or not. I can't tell for sure. But
just one little addition. Higgins and his cohorts also negotiated with the railroad that their shops would be sited in Missoula. Missoula would be a terminal.
Yes.
Not Frenchtown or someplace.
Yes.
They wanted those jobs.
well, that's what I just had there, Bill. Yeah, that's what I just had there in that thing. One thing that I worked on here is trying to make this to where when she gets done filming this, you can go watch this on MCAT sometime and look at these slides, because I try to put a lot of stuff on it that I might not talk about, or I might just babble about. I never know what I might do. But anyhow, so they also, in this edition, okay, Higgins had all these lots that are in blue were given to the railroad throughout this edition. This part to the north of the railroad, he replatted that as a different subdivision. Okay, on part of McCormick's property, by now Higgins, Warden, and McCormick own it, and they subdivide it, and they do the same thing. They go up into here to where the railroad eventually takes part of that, and they donate these lots in McCormick. Interesting thing on here, as you'll see as I go through, is that you have all the presidents. They start numbering the presidents from west to east on the northerly streets, north-south streets. Okay, the railroad addition, which was that piece of Higgins north of the railroad, he created a new subdivision called the Railroad Addition. And you'll see here, Bill, that all of those lots essentially in that subdivision were traded to the railroad for putting those shops and stuff in here. And this is the area to where the original roundhouses were, right down in here. When I'm using this mouse, does that show up good there? I never know. I did about a half an hour talk out at Fort Missoula a couple years ago, and I'm talking along, and I'm doing the same kind of thing, and finally one lady raises her hand and she says, "What are you pointing with? What are you pointing?" And I realized that my mouse wasn't reacting up there. I was sitting here looking at my screen, but my mouse wasn't up there. Okay. So one thing with this railroad addition that you start to see, it and the next three subdivisions, is these subdivisions are created to where they are laid off from the center line of the railroad. Okay? You cannot have the center line of the railroad essentially till it's there. Okay? You might have some stakes, but essentially the railroad, in surveying terms, the railroad's the monument. They don't have right-of-way monuments. The center of the track, 200 feet each side, is the railroad. You know, that's the railroad right-of-way. And so this one and the next three subdivisions are all drawn by the railroad, somebody in the railroad system. They're using what I call is a Leroy lettering guide, which is a way you get these nice, perfect letters. Okay? They're showing stationing and dimension off of the railroad, so they're very definitively being drawn, you know, by a railroad person. You can see the next one, McCormick Addition, which is kind of west of Orange down to Poverello area. Okay, it's got that same kind of lettering. All these blue ones are again the ones that were traded to the railroad. The yellow ones are the two that at that point the Catholic Church owns. Here's the place where the St. Pat's Hospital is still located. Here's the place to where the church is still located. So they had already acquired those from McCormick before he even does this subdivision. Okay, the Erlin Addition, which is kind of north of, you can see here, here's the Providence North Hospital, so it's kind of the south of there going north, and it's east of, I don't remember what this street is, but it's a north-south street, okay? And these are all of the lots that Erlin traded. Interesting thing I found on this that maybe Gary might appreciate this, and maybe Steve Loken, I don't know, but when they're building the railroad, they don't go out months ahead and lay out the center line of the railroad. Those survey crews are ahead of them, helping them get the alignment for the fills and the cuts and everything, and then they're laying lines for the track. And so what they have with this one is they are out somewhere to the west of Reserve Street, and they've come down here to this section corner that defines the difference between Erlin over here and McCormick over here, the school up here, and Higgins over here. They don't want to end up having a little piece that they have to acquire from McCormick here. So excuse me. So they measure 200 feet off of that, and they set a site down here, and that's the way they project their railroad line through there. Anybody find that interesting except me? I find it fascinating as a surveyor. Okay, in the lower Rattlesnake, okay, they create a subdivision, again drawn by the railroad. It includes everything east of Greeno Park, north of roughly Van Buren and Vine, excludes that thing you're talking about with the cemetery. The cemetery never had a survey around it. It was a fence. And so when they subdivided this, they didn't want to deal with that particular piece of parcel, including it in anything, so they just subdivided around it. They also they owned all of this, so they also subdivided over here a little parcel that was connected to the railroad addition on the other side. This is about where, I think on these lots might have been where the original Highlander Brewery was. But they don't include all this stuff in the subdivision. They don't include all this stuff that's on waterworks. Again, they carry on these presidents' names as they work east. 1885, they were able to acquire a parcel of land that was isolated on a railroad section. So they get this little triangle that's north of the railroad, and the railroad has the rest of the section. It's acquired by Frank Woody and later sold to the Missoula Valley Improvement Company. And that's where today's cemetery, the roots of today's cemetery. In 1884, the Sanborn Company comes in here and starts mapping stuff. They create this perspective of Missoula, which is not always perfect. A lot of stuff, they're putting on stuff that isn't there yet. They're putting on stuff that might be there. They're adding big trees somewhere, some places, to where they've just been planted the year before. They're huge trees. Up here in the Rattlesnake, where they've got the subdivision is just done, they've got streets up here. Well, there was no streets. In fact, all of this down here, the streets haven't been constructed as yet. They're just platted. Close-ups of some of these. Here's down at the river. Here's that early bridge. There's the grist mill. There's the area that the sawmill is behind those cribbing. Now the sawmill has moved elsewhere, and this is something else. On the east end, they've created the roads, the streets here, Broadway, Main, and Front, but they connect into where the military road was going over top of the Rattlesnake. Over here, they create, over on the north side, they've got the new train depot here, which is over top, would have been over top of today's Orange Street underpass. They start some hotels here. This is not this is the location of this hotel, but this is today's brick one that was there later, which is the antique store now. They have their first roundhouse down here. Picture of the back side of that roundhouse. And here was interesting is on this, blown up from this thing is they're saying they plan to build this shops the next summer. Do you know how long it was before they did that? This was 1884, Bill.
There's 6 roundhouses been built.
I know that, but this one they're saying in 1884, this one's going to build the next summer.
I think it was very soon to that.
Right. And it was basically going from wood to brick. Yeah.
Bill, is that the earliest Sanborn agreement?
Yes. That's the earliest Sanborn, and I'll show you here in just a second something on that. Okay.
It became a municipality in 1883.
And that is not the total reason why. Okay. But anyhow, so this one, I've still got to do some investigating on this one, but they show on this 1884 view, they show a little building up here that's down kind of there's a little hump down here to the lower left of the M, and I think that's this. I think this was a lookout, and I don't know what it was a lookout for, but it's shown on that map. Okay, so here we get to the Sanborn maps. Okay, and the Sanborn maps were, the Sanborn Company was founded in 1866. The purpose was to map areas so that insurance companies could insure buildings, and they could acquire a copy of the Sanborn maps to tell what buildings were there, what their structure was. You look close and you'll see, like, from this, these are stone. These are stone. Pink ones are brick, and the white ones are frame. They show white here, but it's technically yellow. But they're all frame. And so 1884 is not necessarily because Missoula became a community, but is because it grew big enough to where it justified the Sanborn coming here, I believe. There's a bunch of shots of different views that are shown on that Sanborn perspective of these various buildings, and the old mercantile is here. This has come up a couple of times when Bill gave a talk here 2 months ago, and when Sophie did one a month ago. Parker's Island. Parker's Island, everybody thinks of it as being the island in the middle of the river that we know, us that have been here forever, that we know from our youth, you know, back pre-1965. But Parker's Island was over here, and it was part of the subdivision, and it was segregated by a slough, and that's why it was an island. But it's shown here being built up on in 1891, and with very little on it in 1883, and then during the 1908 flood right here. There it was on the 1902 Sanborn. Look at my time. So the lower half of the Rattlesnake was subdivided in 1888. They had held off because of the, partly because of the cemetery, but also because when the cemetery, the area surrounding the cemetery, this area up in here was owned by Warden, Higgins, and McCormick. This area down here was owned by the Missoula Real Estate Exchange. This area up here is the Missoula Real Estate Exchange, and this area is Woody. And so I think they've solved a lot of their reburials at that point in time. They've reinterred people at the city cemetery, and so they do subdivide it, and this creates another issue because now all these streets are dedicated to the public. So now these streets that are going through this cemetery, those are county over here, or excuse me, those are city over here. This little piece right here is county. This is county over here. This little piece right here is county. Whoops. This piece is county. And all the rest of this is city. But those three entities went together and created that one subdivision and one plat with all of they all signed it. They collaborated. Okay, and they continue those presidents all the way down to, I think this is Pierce. I think this is Pierce down at the end. Do I have any presidential historians in here? People that are well renowned with presidential stuff? They left out Tyler. I think Tyler was a problem child in those days, and so I think I read up on him a little bit a couple days ago, and he was not well thought of at the time. And so they must have left him out. Okay, so 1888, they come back with the next Sanborn, okay, and they've upgraded it. Well, let me jump back here for just a second. One thing I wanted to point out. One thing they show on these Sanborns is because of the issues between Chinese and everybody else, they were concerned whether they might be more susceptible to arson, and so they identified all the Chinese buildings. So these are all identified, these little blue dots are all identified as Chinese on there. So now we come to 88, and that's the next phase of it. You can see one thing is that Missoula has expanded. Okay. This Chinese area, the blue are still the Chinese, which is basically the same ones they had in 1883, but now we have the prostitutes. Ladies, what do they call them? Female boarding, I think, is the terminology they might use, but all in all, that's ladies of the night. And so they have all these other parts, all these other buildings in here. And they, again, are identified the same way as the Chinese, possibly for the same reasons of the possibility of things going on. We're over here now, kind of going down to the east a ways past Patty. Okay, when you look at these Sanborn maps, they really show a lot of stuff, and if you really work at it, you can understand stuff better. This is a picture of the first central school, which is out in the middle of the parking lot at today's Children's Theater. This is today's Children's Theater right here that I've overlaid on there. This part back here in the back was the central school. You can tell the difference in the structures, but that was the central school when I was growing up. I went down there to shop class in the late 50s and was terrified by the patriarch of the Klaus family that's down on Russell, because he taught shop and he had started his career in Miles City with the boys' school, and he was tough. God, he was scary. Okay. God, I must be getting tired. I'm going all over the place. Okay, so here we go up. We're kind of on Pine. We've got a couple of sections here on Pine and Cedar. You look at these close and you can go, I did these going to Google Earth Street Views, and I found the house. I found this house here. That's a brick house. It's got all the configurations. So this one's here on West Pine. This one here is on East Pine. The courthouse was on the site where the courthouse is now. And it was a wood structure set kind of out towards the southerly end. And I found this, I think I don't remember which, I found this in one of my old history books, but this was a conception of the courthouse at the time. Now, this is the way I'm always learning, I'm always thinking things. So last month when I was here, and I got to talking with Steve Loken, who's in the back, and he was a builder and he knew all this stuff, and he told me about how he worked on a house over on the north side that was the old Territorial courthouse. And I said, Steve, it couldn't have been the Territorial courthouse. The courthouse was right down there, right where that is. Well, he says, it's there. He says, the guy told me that it was, and that was the old courthouse. Well, he went and took some pictures that night. He sent me some pictures, and I went over a few days later and took this picture, and beneath the additions on this picture, you can see it, that it's that same structure. And in Alan Matthews' book on the Missoula, he says that when they built the new courthouse down here, they moved that structure. So they moved that whole courthouse to that north side, and it's back on, what did I say, 431 North 3rd? It's kind of northwest of the soup farm after you come out of the underpass up there. This area up here, pretty much, these were all wooden at the time, and they're pretty much all gone. You know, there's nothing that I could find that would indicate any of these. There's new structures overlaid. Here's the old railroad station with a dock out here. Well, we've got a brick structure that lays all along here now. And over here, I think this is the, can't read it on this one. Can you see it? I can't remember what it was called. Gold Dust Saloon. And the footprint is kind of still there. But it's part of other development. Now here is why I had to back off to 1888. Okay, I'm already running almost long, but back off till 1888, because 1888 to 1891, all of a sudden everybody decides they're going to subdivide. So everything on the south side of the river starts getting subdivided. Okay, and then this piece up the Rattlesnake gets subdivided. Stuff out here on West Broadway, this goes all the way down almost to Reserve. All of this is being subdivided. Again, like I think by this time, I think you were required to set intersection monuments 1 foot below the ground, but not necessarily to set all the monument corner or all the lot corners. Okay, but I mean, it's a massive area. So this I might have to take about a half of one night trying to explain all of this. So there you go. Now hit me with your best shot. Yes, Steve.
Okay, raise your hand, I'll bring her around the microphone for the question.
Hey, Bill, that was great. Could you talk about the boulevard on East Pine and how and why that was a boulevard? Because very old houses are there.
If I'd have to dig back and look, but it seems like most of the other streets, for some reason, were 99 feet wide, and it was 101 feet wide, and that's where all the high rollers built. And it's also where the original trolley went down that street and went across the Rattlesnake and went up under the Van Buren underpass and went out to Bonner. So that's the only thing I can visualize is because of those high rollers down there. Yes, sir.
One of the earlier slides showed all the irrigation ditches that people brought in. Those obviously didn't have any legal ownership or anything like that because they're all covered over now, with maybe the exception of a couple ditches. Did they not have any, it was just guy needed water and...
They had water right, okay? The original thing with the ditch, I think I'd have to back way up, but the original ditch filed for so many inches of water to run that mill. Higgins filed for so many inches of water. The water tank and the piping system filed for so many inches of water. There may still be some of those pipes, those old wooden pipes may still exist for all I know, because wood was used for a long time for piping. The Fred line ditch, anybody live in the lower Rattlesnake? Do they still open that water? Do they still run water down there at all?
I would say not below the southern end of Missoula Avenue.
Okay, they run out there, it runs out? Okay. When I was a young man growing up and going to school at Prescott, it ran right in front of Prescott, between Prescott and Harrison, and we had a lot of problems. The teachers had a lot of problems with us jumping back and forth across the ditch and not making it. But yeah, it was very, very prevalent at that time. Yes?
There was water in the ditch in '91 when we bought our house, and he played in it as a child, but what we've heard is when they regraded Van Buren, it caused flooding in neighboring basements.
Oh.
And so they do allow some water down there, but not enough to reach below the southern end of Missoula Avenue.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Yeah, well, first, thank you for a very excellent presentation. It's filled in some missing pieces for me. I've been here in Missoula for 47 years. At one time, I lived on Brook Street in the 300 block for about 25 years, and when I put an addition, I just wanted to put a couple dormers in a 812 pitch roof of a single-story old craftsman house, and I learned pretty quickly when I went down to City Hall that there was such a thing as a design review board, and I don't know if it's still in place. Larry Anderson might know. And I had to get all the drawings approved.
Yeah.
And that's when I found out that East Pine, there's 2 historic boulevards, and I hope they still have the status, which is Brook Street, Old Brook Street, and East Pine, which I thought was interesting. The second thing I just wanted to say was that the town I grew up was platted in the late 1660s. And what was fascinating for me as I listened to you was pretty much a lot of the same dynamics that played out
Yes.
in the development of Missoula, played out in this little town I grew up in, with a developer from England.
Yeah.
And the third thing I want to mention is, if you don't have the contact of Dylan Jans, who grew up here in Missoula, I can give it to you. She was the one with another fellow who did a recent documentary aired at the Roxy
Yeah.
on the cemetery on Cherry Street.
I've seen it 3 times.
Oh,
I went and listened to her at the university.
Do you have her contact?
Yeah, I think so, yeah. Her grandfather JB and I were in high school together. I've known him forever.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Thanks, Bill. Quick question. For the people that claimed land in the Missoula Valley before the 1870 GLO survey arrived,
Yes.
if they happened to claim land that was later found out to be on a school section, how did they handle that?
Let me see if I can quickly back up to kind of illustrate that. In this particular case, you can see, let me see, where is it? Okay, this is what McCormick claimed right here. Okay, and that was his declaration of occupancy. This right here was the school section. Okay, you can see here's Tool run along here, and I can't remember what that is on the north side, but it's a north-south street. So all of this was a school section. So when they came in with the GLO, that's when I say that McCormick picked this, which included a lot of water, a lot of land across the river, but he picked his 160 acres there. And then let the school have all of theirs. And somewhere I could probably go to the old land office in Helena and find records of how they made all that happen. Because it's obviously that they were proving up on one parcel, and then all of a sudden this grid system overlays that parcel, and they don't want to have that grid system, screwed up by those earlier declarations of occupation. So they all, none of them are really, like I said earlier, Cyrus McCork was the only one that might have considered himself to be a long-term farmer. These other, or rancher or whatever. These other guys were just claiming land so they could develop it in the long run. And so they didn't care.
They forced them to evacuate.
I think so. But they didn't even have anything on it, probably. I mean, Higgins had this parcel right here, he had his declaration of occupancy there, so he probably had his house right down here on the edge of it. That was his big enough house, and he probably had a little vegetable garden, so he was growing crops and tilling the soil, and he lived there for 5 years. See? So they didn't care they didn't particularly care. All they were trying to do was acquire 160 acres that was reasonably in the path of the railroad.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Just a little more history. When Montana became a state in '89, they were awarded those 16s and 36s. And if it was proved up fee and simple land with somebody's ownership, then those lands were not really eligible
Yes.
as school trust lands. And the state was given an opportunity to pick up new lands
Yes.
in lieu of those.
Yeah.
But I think in 1872 that really didn't count.
Well, the difference here, I think, is that on those declarations of occupancy, they hadn't proved up yet. Okay, they still had they filed those in '66. Okay, the GLO got here in 70, so that's 4 years. And so they still had a year before they could prove it up. And so somewhere there, they must have done a negotiation with the states, with the Territorial Surveyor. You know, the Surveyor General, I think it was the Territorial Surveyor General. That's what they refer to him as.
I've got one real quick. I was curious about, you had on one of the maps, I think one of the Sanborn maps, the roundhouses.
Yes.
We were talking about those, and I just hadn't heard of that. Like, what was the what were the roundhouses? Why were they built like that? Who was there?
There's your man right there. Tell her what a roundhouse is, Bill.
In the days of steam engines, they didn't run backwards very efficiently, so you had to turn it around and get it pointed forward. So if it came into the house, you had to turn it around, and that involved a turntable to turn that engine around. And then I like to store them with their nose pointed out, and it went away pretty much with the steam era, because diesels could run both ways as efficiently. But Missoula had 6 roundhouses that we've documented. The Missoulian did a very funny article in about 1906. It says they ought to quit that and just make the back wall out of rubber. So as the engines get bigger, they can just push that back wall out. So that's a roundhouse.
Did they do maintenance in those too, Bill?
Oh yeah, they had all kinds of machinery in there, especially as you get into the 30s and 40s. They get these huge big steam engines. They could actually cast frames in there, cast wheels. All the crafts were located in the roundhouse and adjacent buildings.
Cool. Anybody else?
Bill, about 1926, 6 out of every 10 jobs in Missoula.
I would think so, yeah. And if you looked at that, you know, where I showed that land of Higgins to the north of the railroad, part of what they were doing with that is they were putting houses on there for the railroad workers. Any more?
Any more questions? Thank you, Bill.
You bet.
Great, appreciate it.
Thank you.